They're trying to take him. Please, you have to help me hide him. The words tore out of Vivien Rivera before she could stop them, raw and desperate, like a prayer spoken to an empty room. She crouched in the back seat of her 2008 Honda Civic, her thin arms wrapped around a terrified boy who did not belong to her, whose private school uniform was still pressed and clean, whose expensive shoes had never known the pavement behind a homeless shelter. The boy was 8 years old. Maybe 9. His name was Marcus, and she had met him exactly 17 minutes ago. Outside, 3 black SUVs shrieked into the parking lot of the Hanover Street shelter, tires screaming against wet asphalt. Men emerged, 6 of them, maybe 7, dressed in dark clothes that moved with military precision. Their movements were coordinated. Purposeful. The kind of purposeful that meant they were looking for something they intended to find. Vivien pressed Marcus against her chest, feeling his small heart hammer like a trapped bird against her ribs. His mouth opened, a whimper escaping before she could cover it with her palm, gentle but firm. Sure. Just sure. She had her worn backpack shoved against the rear window as camouflage, the same backpack that held everything she owned, 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a photograph of her late husband in a frame that no longer closed properly, and the final notice letter from the debt collector that had arrived 3 days ago, stamped in red ink like a verdict. $200 remained in her pocket. That was all. $200 stood between her and absolute nothing. The men were 30 feet away from the Honda now. They moved between the parked cars with the efficiency of people who had done this before. 30 feet became 20 feet. One of them walked directly past her car, his shoes splashing through a puddle, and Vivien's entire body went rigid. She could smell him as he passed, cologne that cost more than she spent on food in a month, mixed with something sharp and chemical that might have been gun oil. The boy whimpered again, smaller this time, a sound like a kitten. Vivien whispered into his ear, her voice barely a breath, trembling like a candle in the wind. I've got you. I won't let them take you. She didn't know if it was a promise she could keep. She didn't know anything anymore except that this child was terrified and small and someone wanted him badly enough to send an army through a rainy Boston morning to find him. The smell inside the Honda was thick, old coffee from yesterday that she hadn't finished because coffee was expensive and she was rationing it, mixed with unwashed clothes and the particular staleness of a car that had become someone's home. Her home. The shelter had a waiting list that was 3 years long. The YMCA had closed its overnight facility 2 months ago. There were women at the library who slept in their cars, rotating locations every night so the police wouldn't ticket them. Vivien had learned the rotation. She had learned which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms. She had learned to wash her 7-year-old daughter Lily's clothes in the sink of a truck stop and dry them under a hand dryer that took 6 minutes per shirt. But those details came later. First came the men, searching, and Vivien holding her breath so completely that she wondered if she had forgotten how to breathe at all. The men were moving away now, fanning out toward the shelter's main entrance. One of them spoke into a radio, just a burst of static and numbers, coordinates maybe, though Vivien couldn't make out the words. The static crackled like gunfire. In her arms, Marcus went rigid, then began to tremble harder, his whole body shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. Vivien held him tighter. She had held Lily like this before, during the night the fire consumed their apartment. She had held Lily while flames climbed the walls and smoke filled the hallway, and she had run down 3 flights of stairs with her daughter pressed against her chest exactly like this, and she had made it out with Lily and one photograph and nothing else. Everything else was ash. Insurance didn't cover what Derek Collins had done, the deliberately faulty wiring, the landlord who refused to make repairs because he was too busy demanding sexual favors in exchange for not raising the rent. Marcus was still shaking. Still whimpering. Vivien's own heart was roaring in her ears so loudly she could barely hear the men outside, but she could see them through the cracked windshield of the Honda, moving with purpose, searching for something they were determined to find. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Because what you're about to discover is that sometimes, when you think you're saving someone else, you're actually stepping directly into the path of forces so powerful that they remake everything around you. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us understand how a homeless woman with $200 to her name ended up crouched in a car with a stranger's child, holding him like his life depended on her, because very soon, everything would change. 23 hours earlier. The clock on the diner wall read 3:22 in the morning. Vivien Rivera sat in a vinyl booth at Sal's Diner on the corner of Washington and Hanover, nursing a cup of cold coffee she could not afford but had paid for anyway with coins she had counted 4 times before sliding them across the counter. The coffee cost $2.50. She had $217 to her name at that moment, which meant she had just spent money on something that would not feed her daughter. She told herself it was because she needed to sit somewhere warm. The November night outside was cold, the kind of cold that worked its way through the worn fabric of her jacket and settled in her bones like a permanent guest. The shelter on Hanover Street had closed its overnight intake an hour ago. The lot behind it, where she parked her 2008 Honda Civic, was where she and Lily slept. Sometimes. On the nights when Vivien could not bear another minute of the suffocating air in the car, she walked the streets instead, her daughter's hand in hers, moving through the darkness like ghosts. The vinyl of the booth was cracked. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with the sound of dying electricity, like insects trapped in amber. Through the checkered window, Vivien could see the summer thunderstorm intensifying, though it was November, not summer, and the only summer that remained was in her memory, 2 years ago, when she had still been married and her apartment had not yet burned and the word foreclosure meant nothing to her because she owned nothing that could be taken. Lightning fractured the sky outside, splitting the darkness in half. She was alone in the diner except for Tommy, the night manager, who stood behind the counter with his elbows on the laminate, reading a newspaper that was probably 4 days old. He didn't look at her. Tommy had learned not to look at her weeks ago, when she first started coming in at 3 in the morning, ordering the cheapest coffee and sitting for 3 hours, occupying booth 7 because it was in the corner and no one could see her from the street. Vivien's hands wrapped around the cold coffee cup. Her nails were broken, her palms calloused from the cleaning job she had started 2 weeks ago, washing other people's houses during the day. $5 an hour under the table, cash payment only, no contract, no taxes, no protection. Her fingernails had been beautiful once. James used to hold her hand and tell her that her hands were the first thing he had noticed about her, long-fingered and graceful like a pianist's hands. She had never learned to play piano. The letter was in her jacket pocket. She had read it. Vivien had 7 days before everything she had was gone. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. Outside, the lightning came again, and in its flash, she could see the shape of her Honda Civic in the parking lot behind the shelter, the car that was her address, her home, her entire life compressed into a metal box with 4 wheels. Lily was sleeping in the front passenger seat, curled up on her side with her stuffed rabbit under her head and her favorite blanket wrapped around her shoulders. That blanket had belonged to Vivien's mother. Her mother had died when Vivien was 16, and the blanket was one of the last things she had of her. She couldn't lose that blanket. She couldn't lose Lily. These thoughts spiraled in her mind the way they spiraled every night at 3 in the morning, endless and circular and leading nowhere but deeper into panic. The coffee shop hummed. The storm raged. And Vivien sat very still in booth 7, trying to make $2.50 last as long as possible, trying to buy time, trying to buy warmth, trying to buy the illusion that she had control over anything at all. That was when the door chimed. A man stepped inside, soaked through, water streaming off his black wool coat in rivulets. He was tall, taller than the door frame seemed to allow, his head nearly touching the ceiling as he brushed water from his shoulders with a hand wearing a gold watch that probably cost more than her car. His suit was dark and expensively tailored, the kind of suit that whispered of money and power and the kind of life Vivien could not even properly imagine. He must have been in his late 50s, maybe 60, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, thin and pale like a blade drawn across his face. 3 other men entered behind him, younger, wearing similar dark suits, their movements coordinated and precise as they positioned themselves near the door. They were not customers. Even Tommy, who had not looked at Vivien in weeks, looked up from his newspaper. The man with the scar sat down in booth 3, directly across the diner from Vivien, and that was when everything changed. He looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, with eyes the color of storm clouds, and Vivien felt something cold and dangerous stir in her chest, though she could not have named what it was or why it frightened her so completely. His name was Alessandro Ferraro, though she did not know that yet. And in less than 23 hours, a boy would appear in the parking lot behind the shelter, terrified and desperate, and Vivien would hold him and promise to protect him, and that promise would bring Alessandro Ferraro's world crashing down on top of both of them. But that was not yet. For now, there was only the storm, and the cold coffee, and the stranger with the scarred face, watching her from across the diner with an intensity that made her wonder if he could see through her skin to all the fractures underneath. The fluorescent lights of Sal's diner hummed with a sickly yellow glow, casting shadows that made everything look like it was drowning. The black and white checkered floor stretched out like a chessboard where the pieces had already been sacrificed, and at 3:22 in the morning, Vivien Rivera sat alone in booth 7, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup she could not afford. The coffee was cold. She had ordered it 4 hours ago. The price tag was $3.50, and that $3.50 was $3.50 she should not have spent, but the alternative was sitting in her car parked 3 blocks away behind the shelter on Hanover Street, and the shelter closed its doors at 10 o'clock, and she could not bear the thought of Lily waking up in the dark without a human being nearby. Outside, lightning fractured the summer sky into jagged pieces. Rain hammered against the checkered window with a sound like 1,000 small stones thrown by an angry god. The July thunderstorm had been building all evening, and now it was here, and Vivien watched it the way a prisoner watches the bars of her cell, knowing this was her only view of anything larger than herself. Doreen, the night waitress, moved past with a coffee pot and a look of such practiced kindness that it almost broke Vivien's heart. Doreen was 60-something, with grey hair pinned back with a pencil and eyes that had seen too many people in booths like this one, people who ordered things they could not afford because they needed to exist somewhere that was not their reality. "More coffee, hun?" Doreen asked, already tipping the pot. Vivien almost said no. Vivien opened her mouth to say no. But Doreen had already started pouring, and Vivien knew that Doreen was not charging her for this one, the way she had not charged her for the toast this morning, and the water with lemon yesterday, and she closed her mouth and nodded instead, because sometimes survival meant accepting that other people understood your particular flavor of despair. Beside Vivien in the booth, 7-year-old Lily slept with her head against the cracked vinyl cushion, using Vivien's jacket like a pillow. Lily's breathing was slow and deep and utterly innocent. Her hair, which had once been black and glossy like her father's, had lost its shine somewhere in the past 3 weeks. Everything had lost its shine in the past 3 weeks. The smell of the diner pressed down on Vivien like a physical thing, stale coffee grounds, grease that had been used and reused until it no longer smelled like anything recognizable, and the acrid bite of industrial disinfectant that failed to cover anything up. There was a fluorescent light in the corner with a dead fly in it, dead for so long it had turned into dust, and Vivien found herself staring at it because it was easier than staring at anything else. Her right hand lay flat on the table. There was a letter beside her hand. The letter was from a company called Pinnacle Collections, and it was stamped final notice in red ink that looked like blood. The letter said that Derek Collins, her former landlord, was claiming $85,000 in damages, unpaid rent, and expenses related to the destruction of a residential property on Marlborough Street. The letter said she had 7 days to respond before the court would freeze whatever remained of her bank account. The letter was a lie, but it was an official lie, the kind of lie that courts believed, the kind of lie that could destroy a person who had nothing left to destroy. She had $200 in her checking account. $200.14, to be exact. She knew because she had checked it 17 minutes ago on the diner's internet connection, standing in the corner near the bathroom, watching the numbers on the screen like they might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. 3 weeks earlier, there had been a fire. The apartment on Marlborough Street had burned on a Tuesday night. Vivien had been in the shower, washing off the smell of the restaurant where she worked double shifts, and she had smelled smoke first, that acrid chemical bite that did not belong in a bathroom on a Tuesday night. She had wrapped herself in a towel and opened the door, and the hallway was already filling with a thick grey cloud that made her eyes water and her lungs seize. She had run to Lily's room. Lily had been asleep, clutching a stuffed rabbit that Marcus had given her before he died, before the construction scaffold collapsed on him in October, before Vivien had to explain to a 7-year-old that her father was not coming home and that sometimes people just stopped existing without asking permission first. Vivien had grabbed Lily and wrapped her in a blanket and run down the stairs and out into the street where firefighters were already positioning their trucks and neighbors were emerging from buildings in their nightclothes, watching everything burn. The apartment on the second floor was fully engulfed. The flames were moving like something alive, consuming the walls, the furniture, the photographs, the last remaining pieces of a life that had already been fractured by one sudden death. She had stood there on the street, barefoot, wearing only a towel, holding Lily against her chest, and she had watched 7 years of accumulation turn into ash. She had watched her dead husband's Purple Heart medal, which she kept in a box on the shelf above the bed, vanish into smoke. She had watched Lily's baby photos, the one she had printed and framed when she still believed that life was going to be something manageable, curl at the edges and turn to carbon. A Red Cross volunteer had wrapped her in a blanket. Someone had given her borrowed clothes. Someone had called the police to file a report. And Derek Collins had appeared that afternoon, walking through the burnt-out skeleton of the apartment building, walking through Vivien's entire life scattered in black ash and broken glass, and his face had held an expression of triumph. Derek Collins was 43 years old, and he wore expensive shoes that clicked on tile floors, and he had a gold ring on every finger except his thumbs. He had rented the apartment to Vivien 18 months ago, after Marcus died, when she was still moving through the world like someone walking through water. In the first 6 months, he had been pleasant. Professional. The kind of landlord who responded to maintenance requests and did not ask questions about how she was paying the rent. But somewhere in month 7, something had changed. His visits had become more frequent. His excuses for entering the apartment had become more transparent. And one evening, when Vivien had come home from work to find him in her kitchen, he had made the shift from subtext to text, the way that powerful people do when they believe they can do whatever they want. "You're behind on rent again," he had said. His voice was smooth, almost apologetic. "That is not really how this works, Vivien." She had crossed her arms. She had said, "I was 3 days late." "I paid you on Friday." "You did," he had agreed. He had stepped closer. "But late is late, and I am thinking that maybe we should adjust the terms of our arrangement. A woman like you, alone, with a daughter to care for, you must understand that there are ways to pay that do not involve money." His hand had reached for her arm. She had moved away. That was when he had first smiled, that cold smile that meant he was not accustomed to being refused, that meant he was already calculating how to make her regret the refusal. Now, 3 weeks after the fire, Derek Collins had decided to make good on his unspoken threat. The debt claim was fabricated from first word to last. The damages listed had never occurred. The lease amendments were forgeries. But they were official forgeries, the kind that courts processed and judges signed off on, and Vivien had no money for a lawyer to challenge them, no way to prove they were lies except with her own word, and the word of a homeless woman sleeping in her car meant nothing against paperwork bearing official stamps. She had 7 days before the court froze her account. 7 days to find a lawyer she could not afford or to file a response she did not know how to write or to somehow convince a system that had already decided she did not matter. Lightning struck so close to the diner that the whole building seemed to flinch. The thunder came a half-second later, not a sound but a physical force, a blow delivered by the storm itself. Lily jolted awake, her small body rigid with fear, and she reached for Vivien with the desperation of a child who had learned that safety was not guaranteed. "It is okay," Vivien whispered, pulling Lily close, breathing in the smell of her daughter's hair, which still smelled like the strawberry shampoo from the shelter's donation bin. "It is just thunder. Thunder cannot hurt you." This was a lie. Thunder could not hurt Lily, but everything else could, and everything else probably would, and Vivien was doing her best to shield a 7-year-old from a world that had already revealed itself to be fundamentally unkind. Through the window, Vivien watched the parking lot fill with water. Her car was out there somewhere in the darkness. the 2008 Honda Civic that held everything she owned in the world, 3 changes of clothes for her, 2 changes for Lily, a laptop that no longer powered on, and a single photograph in a plastic frame, taken at their wedding 6 years ago, when Marcus was alive and they still believed that loving each other would be enough to build a life on. The rain intensified. It hammered against the window like something trying to break through, like the storm wanted to get inside, wanted to remind everyone in this diner that the world outside was hostile and cold and indifferent to the suffering of people like Vivien Rivera. She held Lily and watched the storm and tried not to think about the money she did not have and the deadline she could not meet and the way that Derek Collins had smiled when he told her that there were ways to pay that did not involve money, because some thoughts, once entertained, never quite left. And 3 blocks away, in the parking lot behind the Hanover Street shelter, the 2008 Honda Civic sat in the rain, windows fogging up, holding everything that remained of a life that had already been broken in more ways than one person should be required to survive. The rain hammered the car like it was trying to break through the metal skin of the Honda Civic, like the storm itself had a vendetta against everything broken and forgotten on the side of Route 128. Vivien gripped the steering wheel at 11:43 in the evening, the clock on the dashboard glowing red, her foot pumping the accelerator as the engine coughed once, twice, then died into absolute silence. She turned the key again. Nothing. Again. The starter whined, but the engine would not catch, would not turn over, would not cooperate with her desperate need to get Lily away from this place, away from this storm that felt personal in its fury. In the back seat, Lily stirred awake, her small voice cutting through the darkness. "Mommy? Are we stopped?" The child was 7 years old, the age when question still held hope instead of dread, when a breakdown on a highway at night was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. "Just for a moment, baby. The car needs to rest." Vivien's hands trembled as she gripped the wheel. She had 1 bar of phone signal. No roadside assistance. No AAA membership, because $17 a month was $17 she did not have. She was 3 miles from the nearest exit. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour, the oppressive summer humidity replaced by cold rain that fell in sheets so thick she could barely see the highway in front of her. Vivien unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the downpour. The rain soaked through her thin cotton shirt in seconds. It streamed down her face, mingled with tears she could not afford to waste on despair, mixed with a taste of metal and fear. She turned back to the car and opened the rear passenger door. "Come on, sweetheart. We need to find higher ground." Lily emerged clutching her stuffed rabbit, her small hand finding her mother's hand as lightning fractured the sky directly above them. The bolt illuminated everything for 1 terrible second, the empty highway stretching in both directions, the guardrail barely visible, the void beyond it, the absolute isolation of 2 people who had already lost everything trying not to lose more. Thunder cracked so loud that Lily screamed, a sound that cut through the storm like a blade through silence. She pressed against Vivien's leg, her whole body trembling. Vivien pulled her daughter close, the backpack on her shoulders heavy and waterlogged with everything they owned. Her shoes were soaked. Her feet were numb. Lily's teeth chattered against her collarbone. They stood there on the shoulder of the highway, waiting for a car that might not come, for help that had never come before, for a rescue that existed only in stories told to children at bedtime. Then the headlights appeared. First 1 pair, distant through the rain. Then another. Then more. A convoy of black SUVs materialized through the sheets of water like something that existed only in nightmares, moving in perfect formation, moving with the precision of men who had trained together for years. They were driving too slow. They were slowing down. They were stopping. Vivien's every instinct screamed danger. She pulled Lily backward, away from the road, her hand shaking as she searched the darkness for an escape route. There was none. The guardrail was behind her. The empty highway was in front of her. The convoy was pulling over. The rear door of the center SUV opened. A man stepped out into the storm without hesitation, without reaching for the hood of a jacket or the collar of a coat. He walked toward them with the kind of deliberate slowness that terrified her more than running would have, each step controlled, each movement precise. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray suit that clung to his chest despite the rain. His dark eyes held the weight of someone who had buried important things deep enough that they were never supposed to surface again. Alessandro Ferraro was 52 years old and had not felt anything genuine in a decade. Then he saw the child. He saw Lily's small hand clutching her mother's fingers. He saw her strawberry blonde hair plastered to her small skull. He saw her age, exactly 7 years old, exactly the age his own daughter would have been if pneumonia had not taken her at 14 months, if he had not stood in a funeral home staring at a white casket so small it fit in the space between his two hands, if he had not then refused to dismantle her nursery for the next 10 years because dismantling it would mean accepting that she was gone. Something shifted in his face. Something in his chest responded to the sight of a child in the rain the way his chest had not responded to anything in a decade. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than Vinnie had heard it since the day they first started working together 15 years ago. "Get in. Both of you." Vivien did not move. Every nerve-ending screamed that these men were dangerous. She could see the shapes of other men inside the SUV, all of them wearing expensive suits, all of them watching with the kind of attention that suggested they were used to following orders without question. "It is a storm. You have a child." Alessandro did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am not asking twice." The door to the front passenger seat was already open. The interior was warm, heated leather, the smell of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic, something like gunpowder. Lily was shivering so hard her teeth chattered audibly. Vivien made a decision that would unravel the next 6 months of both their lives, and she made it in the time it took to watch her daughter's lips turn blue. She pulled Lily toward the SUV. The boy sitting in the passenger seat, Theo, 29 years old, Alessandro's second lieutenant, turned to watch them enter. He had never seen Alessandro offer his suit jacket to anyone. He watched as the boss removed it and draped it around the woman's shoulders without a word, the fabric swallowing her frame, the expensive wool, Italian-tailored, worth more than a month of her old rent, hanging on her like she was a ghost wearing the skin of someone who mattered. The SUV pulled back onto the highway. The convoy reformed around them. Vivien held Lily, who was already falling asleep against her shoulder, her small body finally warm enough to surrender to exhaustion. Alessandro said nothing for the first 2 miles. Then, quietly, "Where can I take you?" Vivien's voice came out broken, fractured like the lightning that had split the sky. "The shelter. On Hanover Street. The Salvation Army shelter." His eyes narrowed. The question came flat and final. "You live there?" "In my car. Behind it." She could not meet his gaze. "For the last 3 weeks." Vinnie, driving, glanced in the rearview mirror. In 15 years of employment, he had never heard Alessandro ask a stranger a personal question. He watched through the mirror as the most feared man in Boston sat in silence beside a woman who had nothing, absolutely nothing, and something in that silence suggested that the evening had somehow shifted into territory where normal rules no longer applied. "What happened?" Alessandro asked. Vivien told her story in fragments, the words coming faster as she spoke, as if speed could make the narrative less devastating, less real. "Marcus. 14 months dead. Construction accident." The company classified him as a contractor, which meant no life insurance, meant no death benefits, meant that she had become a widow at 29 years old with nothing but a 7-year-old daughter and a photograph in a plastic frame. 3 weeks ago, Derek Collins had set fire to the apartment building. Insurance claimed it was faulty wiring. Derek Collins knew it was arson, knew it was staged, knew that 2 of his tenants had been behind on rent. The fire destroyed everything Vivien owned. She and Lily escaped with the clothes they were wearing and 1 photograph. She had 7 days before a court hearing. Derek Collins had fabricated $85,000 in damages. He had forged repair invoices, paid someone to sign false witness statements, created an entire paper cage designed to trap her. In 7 days, the court would freeze what little remained of her bank account, $200, the entirety of her remaining wealth, and award the money to Derek Collins. After that, there would be foreclosure proceedings. After that, they would take Lily. I have nothing left, Vivien whispered. Not even a place to wash her school clothes. Alessandro's jaw tightened. His knuckles were white where he gripped his knee. Theo turned fully around in the front seat, staring at the boss with an expression that suggested the world had shifted on its axis. In 15 years, Theo had never seen Alessandro respond to anyone's suffering. In 15 years, Alessandro had built an empire on the principle that emotion was a weakness that got people killed. The SUV pulled up behind the Hanover Street shelter at 12:47 in the morning. Rain still fell. Vivien reached for the door handle. Wait. Alessandro's voice was a command. Vinny. The Dartmouth property. Vivien's eyes widened. I cannot. Why would you do this? I am nobody. I am a homeless woman with a dead husband, Anne. You are somebody to her. Alessandro pointed at Lily, asleep against her mother's shoulder. That makes you somebody. The Dartmouth property was a modest two-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, modest by any standard, a palace by Vivien's standards. Alessandro had acquired it 7 years ago in a property dispute that had ended with the previous owner relocating to Miami very quickly and very quietly. The apartment had sat empty ever since. He handed her keys and a white envelope containing $3,000 in cash. For food. For clothes. Whatever she needs. Vivien stared at the money like it might vanish, like it might transform into something dangerous, something with strings attached. I will pay you back. I promise. I have a job interview next week, Anne. No need. Alessandro was already pulling the door closed, already signaling to Vinny to drive, already returning to the world of men who understood that silence was more powerful than words. Keep her safe. By dawn, Vivien and Lily were sleeping in real beds for the first time in 3 weeks, their bodies clean, their bellies full, their breathing synchronized in the darkness. Vivien lay awake listening to her daughter sleep, trying to understand what kind of man stops his convoy for a stranger in a storm, what kind of person arranges housing and money without explanation, what kind of heart still beat behind the eyes of someone so clearly accustomed to violence. She did not understand. She would understand later, when understanding would cost her everything. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in Beacon Hill, Victoria Ashford sat at her marble breakfast table reading the Boston Globe. Her mansion held the kind of silence that came with old money, with inherited cruelty, with a lifetime of getting everything she wanted. Her phone buzzed. Derek Collins. His voice trembled through the speaker. The Rivera woman. She is gone. She was supposed to be served papers this morning. Her apartment is empty. Her car is gone. Victoria's smile was ice. Find her, Derek. We have an agreement. You identify them. You create the documentation. I ensure the courts cooperate. We split the proceeds. 12 families in 5 years. Vivien Rivera will be number 13. And we are not stopping until she has lost everything. At that same hour, Theo walked into Alessandro's office. The room was dark wood and darker thoughts, leather chairs facing a wall of old photographs. Theo placed a file on the desk. Inside were 12 names. 12 women. 12 families. 12 patterns of exploitation that had been methodically documented and filed away by someone very organized and very practiced. Derek Collins, Theo reported. 8 instances of coerced sexual favors. Fabricated debt claims. Every one of them homeless within 90 days. The $85,000 claim against Vivien is completely fabricated. The repair invoices are forged. The witness statements were purchased for $500 each. Alessandro did not look up from the file. The rain outside had stopped. The storm had passed. Something else was building. Who else is involved? His voice came flat as a blade. Victoria Ashford. Beacon Hill. Connected to city council, charity boards, old money. She has been directing the pattern. Derek identifies the targets. Victoria uses her connections to ensure the courts rule in their favor. They split the seized assets. Vinny, standing by the door, asked the question everyone was thinking. Boss, why are we doing this? For some homeless woman. Silence. The kind of silence that stretched long enough to matter, long enough for a man to choose between his reputation and his conscience. Finally, Alessandro spoke, and his voice was so quiet that both men had to lean forward to hear it. Because someone should have done it for Sophia. Her name. Her name hanging in the air like a prayer, like a curse that could never be erased, like a daughter who had been dead for 10 years and 3 months. Neither man had ever heard him say her name out loud. Sometimes the people who seem invisible carry the greatest light. That night, the rain had started again. Summer storm sounds drummed against the window of the apartment, the same window that had framed lightning the night Alessandro found her on Route 128. Vivien sat on the floor with her back against the bed, the final notice letter trembling in her hands. 72 hours until the court hearing. 72 hours until Derek Collins and his forged documents and purchased witnesses walked into that courtroom and took everything. Her phone lay beside her on the carpet. 8 calls today to legal aid organizations. 8 waitlists, each one 6 months long. A consultation with a private attorney cost $500. She had $200 in her bank account. $200 between her daughter and homelessness. She stared at the letter until the words blurred. The court would freeze her accounts. Derek would seize the apartment, claim non-existent repair costs, pocket the difference. Lily would go into foster care. Vivien would be erased, filed away with the 11 other women whose names were in Theo's folder, whose lives had already been systematically dismantled by the same predators. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. The internal spiral began, the one she had learned to recognize but could not stop. I cannot beat them. Victoria Ashford owns half of Boston. Derek has forged documents and bought witnesses. The judge will see a homeless woman who cannot even afford a suit and rule against me in 10 minutes. Her breath came in tight, shallow pulls. They will take her. They will put her in foster care. I will lose her. Tears came without permission, silent and devastating, the kind that hurt her chest as they tore their way out. She looked around the apartment, warm, clean, safe for the first time in years, and understood with crystalline certainty that it was temporary. Everything was always temporary. She had learned that lesson on a Greyhound bus with a 3-year-old sleeping against her shoulder and smoke from a building fire still in her hair. Maybe she should just go back to the shelter. Take Lily and disappear to another city. Change their names. It would not be living, but it would be surviving, and she had become an expert at survival. Then her eyes fell on Lily's backpack by the door. A drawing was sticking out, edges bent from being crammed inside with schoolbooks and a lunch box. Vivien pulled it free with shaking fingers. Crayon on white paper, the colors so bright they seemed to vibrate. 2 figures holding hands under an arc of rainbow. A house behind them, a sun in the corner burning yellow so intense it had almost broken through the paper. Underneath, in Lily's uneven printing, one word, home. Vivien's breathing steadied. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and whispered into the silence, not without a fight. 23 hours later, at 6:47 in the morning, Vivien walked Lily toward the school bus stop 3 blocks away. The September sun was breaking through clouds. The rain had stopped. They held hands, Lily chattering about a spelling test, Vivien half listening, her mind already fragmenting into the day ahead, work at the diner, then picking up Lily, then sitting in that apartment watching the clock count down to the hearing. The boy appeared without warning. He was 8, maybe 9 years old, dressed in the navy blazer and pressed khakis of a private school, his polished shoes slapping the pavement as he ran. Not playing. Running with the specific terror that children carry when something ancient and dangerous is chasing them. 3 black SUVs materialized 2 blocks behind him, moving slowly, deliberately, coordinated in a way that made Vivien's spine go rigid. Men emerged from the vehicles. Dark clothing. Casual posture that masked absolute purpose. They spread across the sidewalk in a methodical pattern, checking behind parked cars, moving toward the boy with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The boy's eyes found Vivien for a half-second, raw fear, the kind of desperation that transcends age. He bolted toward a dumpster beside a closed storefront, crouched behind it, trying to become invisible. Vivien did not think. Thought was a luxury for people with time. She dropped Lily's hand, grabbed the boy's arm, and pulled him toward her Honda Civic parked behind the shelter. He stumbled once. She caught him. They reached the car in what felt like an eternity compressed into 5 seconds. She shoved him into the back seat, threw her backpack over him, covered him with her jacket. His breathing was coming in panicked gasps. She pressed her hand gently to his back and whispered, "I have got you. I will not let them take you." The footsteps passed within feet of the car. Vivien could see a man's silhouette through the grimy window, hear his voice crackling through an earpiece. Negative on the east side. Moving to Commerce Street. They waited. The boy's trembling gradually slowed. 2 minutes passed. 5. 10. The SUVs rumbled away. Vivien turned to look at the boy properly for the first time. Dark hair, sharp features, intelligent eyes that did not quite match his age. "What is your name?" "Marco." His voice was barely a whisper. "You have to take me to my father." He will know what to do." She did not ask if he was sure. She had heard the name Ferraro spoken once, in a context that made clear it meant power of an absolute kind. She started the Civic and drove across Boston with a boy she had never met in her backseat, heading toward a building downtown that she remembered from that first night, the office tower where Alessandro worked, where men in expensive suits moved with the casual authority of those who had never been told no. The lobby was marble and glass, the kind of space designed to intimidate. Security moved toward her immediately. She held up her hand, the gesture of someone who had worked long enough in customer service to know how to project certainty even when every cell in her body was screaming to run. She spoke one sentence. "Tell Alessandro Ferraro that Vivien Rivera has his son." The security guard's face changed. He spoke rapidly into a radio. 90 seconds later, the elevator doors opened and Alessandro stepped out. Vinny and Theo flanked him like twin pillars. His expression was guarded, dangerous, controlled, until he saw Marco. The control shattered. Alessandro moved toward the boy and dropped to one knee, pulling him into his arms. His hands shook as he checked Marco for injuries, running his fingers over the boy's shoulders, his neck, his arms. "Are you hurt? Did they do anything?" "I am okay," Marco said, and his voice was so small that Vinny looked away. Alessandro stood, still holding Marco against his chest, and looked at Vivien. In his eyes was something she had never seen aimed at her before. Not gratitude. Not simple relief. Something deeper and more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. "You found him," he said. It was not a question. They were chasing him near the shelter. "I hid him in my car." "You could have been killed. If they had seen you." "I know." The silence stretched between them like a blade drawn across the space. Then Alessandro turned to Vinny and Theo. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop with it. "Find out who gave the order. Bring them to me. All of them." That night at 11:34, 12 men in black tactical gear moved through the Salvatore warehouse on the docks like ghosts. Suppressed weapons. Coordinated through earpieces. They crashed through doors that had been reinforced by money and paranoia and the belief that some lines would never be crossed. Men were dragged from beds, from card tables, from the back room where they had been counting money and laughing about a job well done. Tony Rizzo, the Salvatore underboss who had ordered the kidnapping, was on his knees in the main warehouse when Alessandro walked in. The concrete floor was wet with something that was not water. Tony was trembling, tears streaming down his face, his hands raised in surrender though no one was pointing a gun at him anymore. "It was not personal, Ferraro," Tony said. His voice cracked on every syllable. It was just business. Just business. Please, I have kids, I have. You touched my son. Alessandro's voice was so cold it seemed to freeze the air. There is no business after that. What happened next was methodical and precise and utterly without mercy. Tony Rizzo was zip-tied and handed to a grey sedan that pulled up to the warehouse entrance at exactly midnight. Vincent Costello stepped out of the sedan, studying the bleeding, terrified man with the expression of someone given an unexpected gift. Alessandro walked Tony to the car himself. What you do with him is your concern, Alessandro said. He is yours now. Tony was dragged into the back of the sedan. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the closing door. The sedan pulled away into the Boston night, and Tony Rizzo was never seen again. Meanwhile, 6 blocks away at Derek Collins's apartment, federal agents were preparing for a 6 a.m. raid. FBI, Housing Fraud Task Force, IRS investigators. The file that Alessandro had compiled, the documentation of 8 victims, the forged invoices, the purchased witness statements, everything, had been anonymously delivered to federal prosecutors 3 days earlier. Derek woke to the crash of his apartment door being breached. Guns in his face. Handcuffs snapping around wrists that were suddenly small and powerless. Federal charges stacked like a house that would take decades to burn down. Housing fraud. Extortion. Forgery across multiple states. RICO predicates that would send him away for 40 years if he was unlucky. He was crying as they dragged him out in his underwear, his neighbors filming on their phones, the footage already spreading across social media before his apartment door was even locked. At 7:15 a.m., Victoria Ashford was arrested at her country club. Federal agents and IRS investigators arrived simultaneously. She was in her tennis whites, her racket still in her hand, when they told her she was under arrest for conspiracy, financial fraud, and housing theft affecting 12 families. Her bail was set at $2 million. Her assets were frozen. Every charity board she had ever served on received documentation of her crimes within the hour. Her photograph appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe before noon, socialite charged in housing fraud scheme. By the time the court hearing was supposed to happen, 72 hours after that rainy morning, Derek Collins was in federal custody awaiting trial. Victoria Ashford was facing 25 years in prison plus restitution she could never pay, and the judge had dismissed the case against Vivien with a single sentence: this foreclosure claim is fraudulent and unsupported by any legitimate evidence. Sometimes the people who seem invisible carry the greatest light. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded to the shelter's administrative office where Vivien had listed as her mailing address. The envelope was cream-colored, official, stamped with the seal of the Massachusetts Superior Court. Her hands trembled as she opened it in the break room, Lily at school, the fluorescent lights humming above her head like a swarm of insects. The foreclosure claim against her. The $85,000 debt. All of it. Dismissed. She read the judge's handwritten notation 3 times. The words would not change. Would not dissolve. They remained solid, real, permanent. This foreclosure claim is fraudulent and unsupported by any legitimate evidence. All charges against Ms. Vivien Rivera are hereby dropped. Case dismissed with prejudice. With prejudice. That phrase meant it could never be refiled. Never be used against her again. The cage that had been tightening around her for 8 months had simply opened. The lock had broken. She sat down on the plastic chair and cried for 20 minutes, her shoulders shaking, her co-worker Maria rubbing her back and not asking questions because some moments transcend explanation. That same morning, Derek Collins woke to federal agents crashing through his apartment door at 6 a.m. FBI. Housing Fraud Task Force. IRS investigators wearing jackets that meant authority, that meant the end. The file Alessandro had compiled, 8 victims documented meticulously, forged invoices, purchased witness statements, every thread of criminality traced and photographed and made undeniable, had been delivered anonymously to federal prosecutors 3 days earlier. Derek was dragged from his bed in his underwear, handcuffs snapping around wrists that suddenly felt small and powerless. Federal charges stacked like dominoes, housing fraud, extortion, forgery across multiple states. RICO predicates that would carry a 40-year sentence if the jury believed every word. The video of his arrest spread across social media before his apartment door was even locked. By 7:15 that morning, neighbors were filming him in the hallway, tears streaming down his face, and thousands of strangers online were watching him break. Victoria Ashford was arrested at her country club at 7:30 a.m. Federal agents and IRS investigators arrived simultaneously while she was in her tennis whites, racket still in her hand, when they read her the charges: conspiracy, financial fraud, housing theft affecting 12 families. Her bail was set at $2 million. Her assets were frozen within the hour. Every charity board she had ever served on received documentation of her crimes before lunch. Her photograph appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe before noon, Beacon Hill socialite charged in housing fraud scheme. The article detailed how a wealthy widow had orchestrated social ruin from her mansion, how she had targeted vulnerable women and conspired with landlords to destroy lives. By evening, she had received 300 hate messages on social media. The country club where she had played tennis for 27 years released a statement distancing itself from her completely. Vivien did not know about Derek's arrest. Did not know about Victoria's humiliation. She only knew that the letter in her hands meant she could breathe again. She picked up Lily from school that afternoon. Her daughter was 7 years and 4 months old, small for her age, still afraid of loud noises and sudden movements. Vivien knelt down in the school parking lot and held her daughter's face in her hands. "We're safe now, Lily. Do you understand? We're safe." Lily's eyes widened. "We don't have to move again." "No. We don't have to move again. We get to stay somewhere." "Yes. We get to stay." Lily wrapped her arms around Vivien's neck and held on like she was afraid her mother might vanish. Vivien closed her eyes and let her daughter anchor her to this moment, to this impossible survival. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book that finally had chapters with light in them. Vivien was promoted to assistant manager at the coffee shop on Hanover Street. Her wages increased by $4 an hour. She saved money methodically, $14 a week, then $20, then $35. By month 4, she had $4,000 in a savings account that had her name on it legally. She enrolled in night classes for her teaching certificate, driving Lily to her aunt's apartment after school, attending class until 10 p.m., returning home exhausted but hopeful. Lily thrived in her new school. She made friends named Sophie and Marcus. She stopped having nightmares about fire. Alessandro Ferraro did not contact her directly during these 6 months. But his protection continued, invisible and comprehensive. Her car received anonymous maintenance, new tires 1 week, brake fluid replenished the next, an engine diagnostic performed by a mechanic who never sent a bill. Lily's school tuition, which should have bankrupted Vivien again, was mysteriously paid by an anonymous scholarship fund that had appeared exactly when she enrolled. The scholarship covered all of it. Her night classes received a grant that reduced her tuition by 60%. She suspected the source but did not ask. To ask would be to acknowledge that she was still being saved, still being looked after like a child who could not survive alone. Then, on a Thursday night in March, everything shifted. Vivien was leaving her advanced literacy course at Boston University at 9:30 p.m., carrying textbooks that weighed 10 pounds, her bag on her shoulder, her mind still half in the classroom discussion about teaching reading to children who had experienced trauma. The elevator in the building descended slowly. The lobby was nearly empty. Alessandro Ferraro stepped out of a private elevator on the opposite side of the lobby, emerging from a meeting that had lasted until this hour. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, an open white shirt, his gold watch catching the lobby's light. He saw her. She saw him. Time became strange, contracted, like a breath held too long. He walked toward her deliberately, each step measured. "Vivien." Her name in his voice was a question and a statement and a confession all at once. "Alessandro." She shifted her books. "I didn't know you used this building." "I own it." He paused. I've owned it for 4 years. How are you? The formal politeness was strange between them, given that he had saved her life on a rainy night and she had held his son while sirens approached. She answered anyway. I'm good. Really good. I got promoted at work. I'm in school now, studying to be a teacher. Lily is happy. She has friends. She's thriving. Alessandro listened with an intensity that made her nervous, like every word she spoke was being filed away, analyzed, understood in ways she could not articulate. And you? Are you thriving? She met his eyes. I am. I really am. Good. He paused. I wanted to thank you. Thank me? For what? For saving my son when you had every reason to save only yourself. For reminding me that some things matter more than the life I've built. Vivien stepped closer. The books in her arms suddenly felt lighter. I wanted to thank you. For everything. For protecting us. For making sure we survived. You already did. He studied her face. Would you have dinner with me? Just dinner. Not because you owe me anything. Because I would like to know you. The real you. Not the woman I saved. The woman you are. She searched his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the man behind the reputation, the person who had held his grief alone for so long. Yes. They had dinner at a restaurant in the North End, one with soft lighting and waiters who knew Alessandro by name and seated them at a quiet corner table without being asked. They talked for 3 hours, and the conversation was not the superficial exchange of two people meeting for the first time. It was deeper, more honest. It was the conversation of two people who had already saved each other and now wanted to understand why. Vivien told him about Marcus, her husband, about the life she had lost and the life she was building from its ashes. She talked about the fire, the desperation, the moment she thought she would never survive. She talked about Lily, about the weight of single motherhood, about the terror of being invisible to a world that only valued women with resources. Alessandro told her about Sophia, his daughter, about the nursery he had finally dismantled last month. He had removed the pink curtains, the white crib, the mobile of tiny stars that had hung untouched for 10 years. He had packed it all away and donated it to a children's hospital, finally allowing her memory to exist in a space where other children could benefit from her absence. I've been watching over you for months, he said quietly. I needed to know you were safe. I needed to make sure that saving someone could still matter in a life like mine. Vivien reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were warm, scarred, strong. It mattered. You mattered. You still do. The romance that bloomed was not the rescue narrative that had begun on that rainy night. It was slower, deeper, built on equals recognizing each other. It was built on the knowledge that they had both survived impossible things and had emerged as people who understood the fragility and beauty of life simultaneously. 18 months after the storm, Vivien's life had transformed completely. She had her teaching certificate. She worked at an elementary school in a good district, teaching 2nd grade, a classroom filled with plants and color and children who loved her because she understood that trauma lived in small bodies and manifested in small behaviors. She rented a real apartment, 2 bedrooms, safe neighborhood, lease in her name. Lily was 9 years old, confident, happy, no longer afraid of loud noises. Vivien had $12,000 in savings. She was stable. Independent. Strong. Alessandro was part of her life now, had been for 8 months, slowly and carefully, building trust. Marco, the boy she had saved, called her Aunt Viv and came to their apartment every other weekend. She met Alessandro's men as an equal, not a charity case. Vinny joked that she was the only person who made the boss smile. But the story's title still hung over them like a prophecy yet to be fulfilled. 50 men. The detail from the premise that had not yet arrived. It came on a Saturday morning in April. Vivien was in her apartment, grading 2nd grade papers, Lily eating breakfast at the kitchen table, when the knock came at the door. She opened it to find Vinny and Theo standing in the hallway, both in suits, both grinning like they knew something she did not. "Boss says you might need help moving today," Vinny said. Vivien was confused. She was not moving. "I think you have the wrong." She looked outside. Down the entire street, black SUVs lined the curb like dominoes. 50 men. More. They were standing beside furniture, holding boxes, carrying tools. Alessandro stepped forward, holding a set of keys. His dark eyes held hers. "The house 3 blocks over," he said. "For bedrooms. A backyard for Lily. It's yours. Paid in full. No strings, no conditions, no debt owed. Just a home for you and your daughter and anyone else you choose to let into your life." Vivien could not speak. She could not breathe. Tears came like rain. "Alessandro, I can't." "You can. You've rebuilt yourself. You stand as my equal. This isn't charity. This is me asking you and Lily to build a life that has room for me in it too." She kissed him in front of all 50 men, who cheered and whistled and began unloading furniture with the precision of people who had done this before, who understood that this moment was sacred because it represented transformation. Lily ran outside, saw the men, saw the house keys, saw her mother crying and kissing the man who had become part of their lives. She understood what the others understood. The family she thought she had lost was being replaced by one she never expected. The final image was simple. Vivien and Lily standing in front of their new house, Alessandro beside them, his arm around Vivien's shoulders. Marco ran up with a soccer ball. The men were unloading furniture, laughing and joking. Vivien looked at Alessandro, at this impossible life, and whispered, "Thank you." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you for reminding me what matters." Vivien Rivera had lost everything, her husband, her home, her hope. She had been invisible to a world that only sees wealth and status. But when it mattered most, she chose courage over fear, a stranger's child over her own safety. And that choice set off a chain of events that brought justice to the cruel and protection to the vulnerable. Sometimes the people who seem invisible carry the greatest light. And sometimes, the most powerful man in the city is the one who recognizes it. If this story moved you, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to remember that one act of courage can change everything. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story about the unlikely people who change each other's lives forever. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. No matter how hard life gets, remember that after the rain, the sky clears. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video.